And we have some news just in. We're learning that Russia says it has a new concrete proposal to resolve the Syrian conflict. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Washington is studying it. We're covering all angles of this. In Moscow is CNN's Matthew Chance. But first we'll start in Washington with Elise Labbot. Elise, the US Secretary of State John Kerry has had many meetings with Russia's foreign minister. They have serious differences when it comes to Syria. Is this the development the US has been hoping for?
Well, Lynda, it's certainly the development that the U.S. has been hoping for, but whether it's just another dash expectations remain to be seen. We just heard from Secretary Kerry just a few moments ago. He's meeting with the Egyptian foreign minister, and he's talking about efforts to get a ceasefire together on the ground in Syria. You have this meeting coming up of the International Syria Support Group in Munich in a couple of days. This group, of course, includes all the players interested in Syria, with interest in Syria, not just Russia and Iran, but Saudi Arabia, who's also backing a lot of the opposition groups. Now, Secretary Kerry has been trying to get a ceasefire together to start these talks. After they started, he is saying that Russian actions on the ground, the bombing of Aleppo, what they're doing on the ground, is not conducive to the kind of negotiations that they want to see. And so the hope is that perhaps they can get some humanitarian access. Maybe we'll see some kind of announcement on that at Munich. But certainly he does want to see a Russian commitment to stop the actions on the ground. Because when you talk about a ceasefire, it's not just about Syrian forces and the opposition. It's also about Russia, who's conducting a lot of the bombing against the opposition right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. I just want to go to Matthew now in Moscow. Matthew, Russia says it has a concrete plan. What are you hearing from the Kremlin?
Well, the Kremlin isn't commenting on this directly. It's all coming from the foreign ministry and the foreign minister himself. And he's given an interview to a Russian newspaper. And in that interview, he's talked about this concrete plan. And this is what's been picked up now, this concrete plan to bring to an end the conflict in Syria. It's elements of the plan, he says, have been basically presented to the United States throughout the course of their meetings. The implication is that those meetings have been multiple over the past several days, at the very least, perhaps longer. What we're not getting from this interview, nor from the Kremlin, nor from the Foreign Ministry, who we've tried to contact since this interview was published, is any indication of what the terms of this concrete plan include, whether it involves an immediate ceasefire, whether it involves the provision of humanitarian corridors into the areas where so many people have been trapped by the bombing, whether it involves a suspension of the ferocious bombing campaign that Russia has been intensifying at the, to back up the Syrian army. And so we've got no detail at this point about what kind of plan this is that's being proposed.
OK, well, we will come back to you when there is some more detail. Matthew Chance in Moscow and Elise Labbot in Washington. Thank you both. Now, for Bashar al-Assad's supporters in the capital, the push into Aleppo is cause for optimism. Frederick Plagton reports from Damascus.
The Syrian army's recent advances against rebel groups have bolstered the Assad regime's position. And they've clearly also had an impact here in government-controlled Damascus. More traffic, more people out on the streets, and more optimism among regime supporters. Things are getting better thanks to the leadership of President Assad, this man says, and thanks to the Syrian army and the paramilitary forces. And this man adds, our army is winning. It's a strong army, and it's protected by God. But for much of last year, the Syrian government was losing ground. Various rebel factions closed in on government strongholds in the north and the south of the country. But Russian air power and help from pro-Iranian militias appear to be turning the tide in this 5-year conflict, leading some to question the point of diplomacy. While the UN and the United States continue to say that only diplomacy can solve the Syrian crisis, an increasing number of people here in government-controlled territory seem to believe that there could be a military solution to the conflict. That is, if Bashar al-Assad's army can build on the gains it's made in recent weeks. But the government's offensive comes at a high price. Tens of thousands fleeing toward the Turkish border, looking to escape the onslaught. Meanwhile, speculation that Assad's main adversaries, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, might be planning incursions into northern Syria, leading to this warning from the foreign minister. Any troops that invade our territory will go home in wooden coffins, Walid Mualim said. And even on the streets of Damascus, not everyone is sure the government's momentum will carry on.
I don't think it's going to end like any soon. I don't think anyone is winning. Like it's a no end. I don't know. It's my personal opinion.
Even with the optimism brought on by the recent gains, one thing remains the same for Syrians: the uncertainty of what the future will bring. Fred Pleitgen, CNN, Damascus.
Turning now to Hong Kong, where officials say more than 120 people were injured during clashes between protesters and police. The violence erupted as the city celebrated the Lunar New Year. Our David Molko has more on what triggered the unrest.
Warning shots fired on the streets of Hong Kong after running battles between police and protesters overnight. Police say the trouble started after government officials tried to clear away illegal food stalls, which they normally turned a blind eye to. Some bystanders got involved, and the officials called in the police. The situation escalated into a riot. Protesters starting multiple fires, both sides throwing rubbish bins and barriers, and some even pulling up bricks from the sidewalk.
They damaged police cars and public properties, committed acts of arson, threw bricks and other objects at police officers, including those who had already been injured and were lying on the ground.
More than 120 people were hurt, police say, including 90 police officers, some suffering broken bones. Dozens of protesters and several members of the media were also injured. Authorities arrested more than 50 people after police used batons and pepper spray, even firing 2 shots of live ammunition into the air, which they defend as a move to protect injured colleagues. Police call those involved localists. It's a loose term for the more hardline groups of anti-government protesters that emerged in Hong Kong following the peaceful Occupy protests of 2014. On Tuesday night, police upping their numbers as Hong Kong holds its annual fireworks display to mark the Lunar New Year. David Molko, CNN, Hong Kong.
Live from CNN's World Headquarters, this is Connect the World. We'll get the latest from New Hampshire in less than 15 minutes. Also, we'll look at the key to success in one of the world's most recognisable cities. 1 square metre is in Las Vegas. Up next.